Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Minister Tanchos. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting the World Bank and for organizing this conference, which I think is a great step also in Romania to show how many activities are currently ongoing and what major steps Romania is currently undertaking to further the circular economy in the country with the adoption of the strategy last year and all the other activities that have been explained right now. I would just share my screen because I have prepared a presentation. All right, I hope you can all see the presentation. It's okay?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, it's okay.
So, my pleasure today is to present to you two World Bank reports that have been published, one last year, one will be published in the coming days. The first one is an EU report, Squaring the Circle Policies from Europe's Circular Economy Transition, basically describing the state of the art of the circular economy in Europe and what measures need to be taken to enforce it in view of also supporting developing countries, because this, of course, is the World Bank's mandate to reduce poverty and to ensure that developing countries are not left behind in the circular economy transition. And the second report is a report that will be published in the following days. It's a diagnostic analysis in Romania, which basically gives an overview of the activities that are ongoing and what kind of measures might need to be taken in the future in order to enhance and accelerate the circular economy transition. So maybe just as a little background on why we're actually talking about this. Basically, the global consumption of natural resources is continuously increasing. Basically, over the last 50 years, we have consumed more resources globally than over the entire humankind before the 1970s. And we have now reached levels of about 100 billion tons per year that the global economy needs in order to function. If the trend continues as we foresee over the next couple of years, we will see that by 2050, global resource consumption will yet double again to about 200 billion tons per year. And of course, this has major consequences on the environment in terms of, pollution, in terms of emission. It is estimated that about 90% of biodiversity loss is related to material consumption. About 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions are related to material consumption. Health impacts, deforestation, soil depletion, water stress, you mentioned it. Most of the environmental threats that we are basically faced with globally, but also in Europe, are due to an overconsumption of natural resources. And what's very interesting from a developing perspective is that there is a strong development dimension to resource use. Resource use is extremely uneven distributed across the world. The average US American, for example, consumes about 22 tons per year of natural resources. The average citizen of an African country would consume about 5 tons per year. Or to put it even more bluntly, the wealthiest billion of people on the planet consumes 72% of the world's resources, whereas the poorest billion of people consumes less than 1% of the natural resources. So there's a very strong development dimension in talking about the circular economy. And of course, the circular economy gives us the promise, basically, that by reducing the amount of virgin or primary natural resources that we need for our economy, that we can also reduce pollution, emissions, and environmental and health impacts globally. However, it's not that simple because the circular economy is really a what we call a super wicked problem. It is a very, very complex system-wide issue. It recovers a system transformation. It doesn't look at individual sectors, but it's cross-sectoral. In terms of policy, it's not an issue of one ministry or one agency. It requires a all of government approach, basically linked to the highest level, if possible. At the same time, it's still an emerging policy agenda, which is sometimes still at the fringes of national policy making. And therefore, it faces difficulties in the implementation still. Last but not least, maybe just to mention, of course, there are costs involved in the transition and not just benefits. The benefits are usually stressed, but there are enormous costs also to industry and to the private sector. And of course, there are not just winners, but there are also many losers. Losers in terms of sectors, like resource-intensive sectors that might lose out, regions that might focus or make a living from linear activities that might lose out. So these need to be taken care of. Let me just give you a few insights from what is happening in Europe right now. So the first message is that reducing resource use is very tough also in Europe. The circular material use rate in Europe is currently at around 12%, which means that more than 88% of materials used in the EU economy actually go to waste in the medium or long term. At the same time, domestic material consumption in Europe is declining, as you can see in the top right graph, which is the red line. But when we take into account all the materials that are embodied in the imports that we receive from other countries, then we actually see that material consumption of Europeans is rather stable. It's not declining. To give you an example, the weight of a laptop, for example, is about 1 kilo. The materials used to make that laptop is about 1 ton. So much of that is fallen on the factory floor, is wasted. And this happens in third countries and is usually not accounted for in the material statistics in the EU. But if we do account for that, then European resource consumption is stubbornly stable. The second point is that the circular economy will not happen without the private sector. The private sector is key in the transition. At the moment, circular business models only make up about 5 to 10% of the market, so very limited. And this is because there are various barriers that companies are faced with. This graph on the right, and you can also read this, in more detail, of course, in the report, shows what kind of barriers companies are faced with. In the inner circle, it's really the company's issues themselves, the corporate culture that is not right. SMEs, for example, small and medium-sized enterprises, do not have the capacity to deal a lot with environmental issues. They don't have the resources. And they might not even get to the step where they might consider a circular business model simply because they do not know about the benefits of it. Then you have on the outer circle, you have the wider kind of macro level barriers. For example, that secondary or recycled resources continue to be more expensive than their primary or virgin alternative, and therefore are often very unattractive to businesses to use. But there are many others, barriers that companies are faced with, including a lack of consumer demand. If there's no market for your product, then you're not going to be successful with a circular business model. The third lesson from Europe, and this is modeling from this EU report that I was referring to before, is that circular economy policies, for example, subsidies to circular activities, or taxes to very resource intensive activities, are costly, and they might lead to a decrease of GDP of about 1% compared to the baseline by 2030. So there is a cost involved in introducing these policies. However, when we recycle the revenues from a circular economy tax, for example, and help to reduce taxes on labor, then these negative effects can be counterbalanced, and we actually see a positive impact on growth and labor. So this kind of transition of taxation from labor to resources has a strong economic benefit that we have modeled in our report. The fourth issue is that Europe is not in a bubble, obviously, and there is a strong cross-border dimension of circular economy policies in the EU. As I mentioned before, developing countries are particularly exposed to EU policies because a large share of their exports, for example, constitutes material exports. Their exports tend to be undiversified, and often they lack capabilities to adapt to export shocks. So they're very dependent on what Europe does in terms of circular economy policies. And this is also the fifth and last message from this report, is that as the EU strengthens its circular economy policies, there's a kind of regulatory gap that might exist between the EU and developing countries, which might lead to resource-intensive industries to relocate to developing countries, and therefore to kind of lead to some kind of linear production havens. This is why it's very important for the European Union not to act in isolation, but to act in cooperation with third countries and also to help them to achieve the circular economy transition. What needs to be done to achieve this transition? It requires a comprehensive policy package. And we have identified this package in terms of the so-called IIIF framework, meaning that the right incentives need to be set for more circularity. Information needs to be provided to take the right decisions. The institutions need to support the transition. And of course, there needs to be sufficient finance to move forward. In terms of institutions, and I will be very brief on this because time is short, probably the most important point marked in red here is that we need a whole of government approach. We need coordination and cooperation on the horizontal level, on the national level between different ministries and agencies, but also on the vertical level between the national, regional, and municipal levels. This is essential in order to mainstream circular economy objectives into policy making. In terms of information, consumers need to be given better information to take the right choices. For example, by tools such as product labeling, for example, so that consumers can see whether a product is, whether it's repairable at all or not, how long its expected lifetime is, for example, so that consumers take decisions on criteria that include circular economy measures. For businesses, in terms of information, it's very important to share best practices and to have easy access to these best practices in order to be able to replicate them and to learn from other companies, both from their successes, but also from their failures. On incentives, it's all about prices. Price signals need to reflect the negative externalities of the current system, but they also need to reflect the benefits of the circular economy. So, for example, we need to phase out subsidies for linear activities. I mean, fossil fuel subsidies are one of the biggest examples because the EU still spends like 55 billion euros a year on fossil fuel subsidies. At the same time, circular activities like reuse and repair need to benefit from a kind of tax relief so that these kind of activities are actually enforced and supported. What I mentioned before, a circular fiscal reform needs to entail a shift of the tax burden from labor to materials in order to reduce material use across the whole economy and all sectors. In terms of finance, we don't see a lack of finance in the EU right now for circular economy measures, but there are still these kind of linear biases in the financial system which need to be removed. And very importantly to mention here is public procurement, because it makes up a huge part of EU GDP. It's millions of euros that are spent by governments every year, and governments can create markets. So they can create markets for circular products if their procurement activities are more geared towards circularity in particular. Let me now give you a few insights about the second report, which is the report on Romania. This is, a rapid analysis. It's not an in-depth analysis, but it's a rapid analysis of the status of circular economy implementation in Romania and gives some recommendations on how to accelerate progress towards circularity.
Domnule Arno BEHRENS, îmi cer scuze că vă întrerup. Rolul meu aici nu e doar de moderator, e și de gardian al timpului și atunci o să vă rog să dacă puteți scurta și limita partea aceasta de prezentare la maximum 2 minute, pentru că deja ne-am decalat foarte mult de la programul pe care l-am setat inițial. Mulțumesc.
Yes, I understand. Sorry for that. I will be very brief also because I'm sure you know the Romanian situation very well. So Romania is still at the beginning of the circular economy transition. It scores low on most of the circular economy indicators compared to other European countries, but there are many local frontrunners that give very promising results also for other regions to replicate. This study is based on a survey and interviews. So what I'm presenting to you is really the view of stakeholders. And basically they see an increasing role of circular economy, not just in terms of their understanding of what it actually is, but also in terms of their application. And in terms of application, they're really interested in optimizing processes, reducing production costs associated with primary raw materials, and to also reduce waste disposal. The SWOT analysis that we have undertaken shows that there is high potential for circular economy in Romania. The government understanding and commitment to the circular economy is high, with the with a large body of waste management legislation, with the circular economy strategy being adopted, and financial support schemes for companies in place. At the same time, there are opportunities, in particular related to the EU also. EU as a driver for policy change, the European Green Deal, the Circular Economy Action Plan, and so on, are really drivers also for circular economy policy in Romania. And of course, there is also very much EU funding available for the transition, which Romania can benefit on. But there are also some substantial weaknesses. And probably the largest weakness that we have identified is really the lack of implementation of national strategies and programs, which also relates to weak monitoring, reporting, and enforcement. And there are various reasons for that. EU legislation is still not fully transposed. And basically, there remains a very low level of separate waste collection in municipal waste and a strong informal waste collection sector. In terms of threats, the low public awareness is an issue. I mentioned this in the EU context. Without public demand for products, it's very difficult to find markets. Circular economy activities are still often considered as more expensive than linear activities. And of course, there are large investment requirements in Romania and in other countries across the EU. Let me now finish. I'm almost done. So these are the activities that we have identified for future action in Romania, which could potentially be supported by international financial institutions. These relate to building up reuse and repair centers. These relate to increasing the level of information on circular economy data, but also business models in Romania. And on developing secondary legislation for circular economy to implement EU legislation. I'm sorry if I took a bit longer, but these are the two reports in a nutshell. I look forward to your questions.
Mulțumim mult pentru prezentarea dumneavoastră. Am o întrebare scurtă și aș aprecia un răspuns de asemenea pe scurt. Și întrebarea mea scurtă sună așa: dacă există niște exemple simple și concrete ca bune practici pe care o economie circulară începătoare sau incipientă ca a României le-ar putea împrumuta de la alte state?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the circular economy can be a very complex undertaking if you talk about, redesigning products and products line and value chains. But it can also be a very simple measure if you look at simply extending the lifetime of products, repairing products. This is something that is done across the world on a daily basis. Simply for a lack of finance, also for being able to buy new products. So these kind of repair and reuse centers, for example, are a win-win situation because they can be rather simple to install. They create jobs, local jobs, and they actually lead to a longer life of products and therefore to cost savings for consumers.